Drunk and abusive. Stories from Grandma's life. Drunk and abusive. The town drunk. Hello, y'all. I'm Dianna, Brianne. I don't give advice, suggestions, information, recommendations. I do share with you my perspective on different topics. I hope you like, share, subscribe. All 5 channel names are pinned to the top of the comments section or the description box below. All 5 channels have fresh and new content. Well, what's Grandma talking about today? Well, you know, growing up, I grew up on Grandma's porch, and as I talk about all the time, we had a lot of relatives. We had this huge family, a huge extended family, and then a family of friends. And everyone would gather on Grandma's porch several times a week. We grew up on Grandma's porch. We played in the yard in Grandma's porch. And I've often talked about Grandma's porch and her little house with 3 different porch swings. We had a lot of conversation, and sometimes there was conversation going on each one of the porch swings. And so and I've been talking about a lot of different issues. When you get families that big, you have a lot of good times and a lot of wonderful times, a lot of wonderful moments, and you also can get some challenging and difficult ones. And also, with that many family members and friends, you always heard about some kind of problem, one kind of problem or another, because, well, people have problems. And so on Grandma's porch, we solved the world's problems, we solved our own problems, we solved each other's problems, way back before there were counseling and psychologists and all that, you know, for mainstream people. And so we just solved our problems over on Grandma's porch. And so, you know, the town drunk was somebody that lived in Grandma's little town. And one day, one of the family friends came over and sat on Grandma's porch, and she talked about how her husband was always drunk. He was very, very verbally abusive, and it was very challenging and difficult for her. And she didn't know what to do. And first of all, Grandma said, always do the safest thing. Be proactive in your safety. You know, if you need to get away, get away. Grandma always told her that she could even come stay in her little shanty. She had a little shanty, like a little house down the hill a little bit in her yard. And she said, you know, you can always come there and stay. And I think a night or two, maybe that woman did come there and stay. I am not sure. And yet, Grandma, you know, she never put up with anything like that. She said, you know, I would never put up with anybody drinking and being abusive or being nasty. And that was Grandma's philosophy. She believed that everyone needed to be treated with dignity and respect, whether you were married to the person, man or woman or wife. She said she even remembered a woman who got drunk all the time and was nasty to her husband and very verbally abusive to her husband. She said that did not sit right, and no one should need to tolerate that. And sometimes people need to just simply walk away from a relationship. And back then, they didn't have, you know, battered women's shelters and places like that. All they had, you know, you had a friend if you had a friend, and some people didn't know where to go, and they had to withstand, you know, a lot in some situations. But, you know, Grandma never believed in letting anybody be abusive, whether it's verbally or otherwise. And so Grandma's place was always a safe place to come to. It was always a place that one could come to and feel safe. And she said everyone needs to feel safe in their life. And, you know, growing up, I've told the story that my mother was married a couple times. My mother was an amazing, wonderful woman. I've told this story about I had a wonderful stepfather towards the end, and growing up later in my years, I had an amazing stepfather. But when my mother and father divorced, my mother also married what we called the town drunk, and he would get very verbally abusive. And I remember it was very traumatic for me as a very young child. I would have to, sometimes when he was drunk and yelling and screaming at my mother, I would have to go out into the backyard and hide in the weeds until he fell asleep and got over his drunk. And then the next day, of course, he was very, very sorry for his verbal outpouring of negativity and cuss words and things like that. And so I know what it's like to live with a verbally abusive or otherwise abusive person. And that happened when I was growing up, and I always knew I would never want anyone like that in my life. And after that, I never did. And for me, I never liked alcohol for that reason. I had like an aversion to alcohol and drinking. And I used to pour the beer. If I saw someone in our family bring beer into the house, I would just dump it down the drain when I was like 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old. And I used to do that with cigarettes too. I used to get rid of the cigarettes and people get mad at me. You got rid of my cigarettes. You got rid of my booze, you know. But I didn't want to be around it because I also knew with that one particular stepfather, and remember my mother had several husbands, and the one towards the end was amazing and wonderful. He was an amazing stepfather, and I was so blessed to have him. But the one along the way, he, and I think he rehabilitated later. I think after my mom and he got a divorce, he did rehabilitate, and I think he became very religious, and I'm so grateful for that. But during that time, it was very challenging. He would get drunk and he would get abusive, and as a small child, I had to hear that, and I would have to go hide until he got over his drunk, and so no one should have to go through that, no one. And then my mother left him. She did what Grandma always said, and she left. And it was difficult and challenging. There wasn't sometimes enough money, but we always ate well, and we had the car that drove in reverse, as I've talked about before, and the poor people's boxes, which were before food stamps, and we used to go out and get one of those boxes, and it was filled with flour and sugar and maybe a little can of those compressed meats or something like that, milk and eggs. And we always had enough to eat. And my mother was very good with money, and she was a wonderful mother. And so what I'm saying is this was the town drunk. And, you know, I remember going to school and they'd say, yeah, your mom's married to the town drunk. You know, and that was so embarrassing and so humiliating to a young child at that point. So when my mother married the good stepfather at the time, I was so proud. I don't want to say prideful because I was never prideful. That's a different meaning. But I was so proud to have a stepfather that I could be proud of. And my own father, I later became reunited with later in life, and we had an amazing relationship and a wonderful relationship. And my biological father, which is a whole nother story, I became acquainted with, but never really knew he was my biological father till later. And then when I tried to reconnect with him, he had passed on. And so, but he knew of me and I knew of him, and he had great memories, as short-lived as they were, of me, and I had some very fond memories of him as well. And I've talked about that in other videos. And so the thing is that when you deal with alcoholism or drunkenness or abuse of any kind, that's not good. It affects the whole family. And so we were affected, but also the woman who used to come to Grandma's, she eventually, I believe that actually her husband, she left him, and then they went back together, and he completely quit drinking, and they had an amazing, wonderful marriage from then on out. But Grandma said never, ever, ever tolerate any kind of abuse or any kind of anything that's verbal or otherwise. Just don't tolerate it. And that was her standing. And my grandpa, he is wonderful to Grandma. He never spoke up to Grandma. They had a great relationship, but he was always respectful to Grandma. And so Grandma believed in marriages should be respectful. And like I said, she also knew a woman who was abusive to her husband verbally and otherwise, and she said that was equally as terrible. You know, men can be victims too, as well as women, so it goes both ways. And either way, it's not what a marriage is about. It's not what a marriage should be. And Grandma believed in getting away from anything like that as quickly as you can in a safe way and for the good of everyone. And I grew up in that kind of environment. Today, I don't like to be around people who drink because I just don't. And that probably comes from my childhood. I know many people who have a glass of wine and they're perfectly fine, and I have no issue with that. It's just that people that cannot control their behavior or become sloppy with drinking, I most certainly am not around. And you know, because I remember those years of alcoholism or drunkenness or someone just not being that they were abusive. You know, it was terrible. So, you know, if you're an abusive drunk or a drunk, perhaps you need to really rethink your life. And if you're someone who is around someone like that, perhaps you need to rethink your life too, and how you want to go forward and how you want to perhaps live your life in a most positive way, because that's not a right way to live life as far as I'm concerned and as far as Grandma's concerned. Okay? So I just thought I'd come on here and talk a little bit about the town drunkenness, and how one has to respect their own selves to get away from that. From my house to yours, and God bless you. I hope you like, share, subscribe, and I hope to talk to you soon again. Bye-bye.